Imagine dimming the lights in your room, a soft hum of a fan in the background, the world outside already forgotten. The Middle Ages have arrived, and tonight we are not trudging through mud, dodging plagues, or attending yet another sermon that drones on until even the saints would nod off. No, tonight we wander into the strange, fragrant, and often disastrous world of medieval intoxication. The truth is, people of the Middle Ages were not as stiff and joyless as the paintings suggest. They were curious, reckless, desperate, and sometimes just bored enough to look at a suspicious root or a questionable flower and think, yes, that will probably help me survive another day in this drafty wooden box I call a home. And so, just like us, they searched for ways to dull pain, escape despair, and occasionally throw open the doors of perception, even if it meant waking up naked in a haystack trying to explain to the neighbors why you swore the moon had been speaking French the night before. To understand why people reached for these substances, we need to imagine their world honestly. Imagine no electricity, no coffee, no aspirin, and certainly no antidepressants. Your daily entertainment consisted of watching a cow chew slowly in the field, or maybe attending a hanging if you were lucky enough to live near a town with a gallows. Life was full of grinding labor, hunger, and the constant smell of damp wool. And in that atmosphere, a small clay cup of spiced wine, laced with herbs that promised prophetic dreams, didn't just sound appealing, it sounded like salvation. For a few hours you could escape the weight of the feudal system pressing down on your back, forget the tax collector, the toothache, and the looming certainty that another plague was on its way. The Middle Ages were not just a time of kings and crusades, they were also a time of ordinary people doing everything they could to make existence less unbearable. Before you drift off, do me a small favor and tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. We might imagine medieval stoners, a pair of barefoot peasants, giggling behind a haystack, but that's not quite accurate. No one used the word high. Instead, they spoke of visions, divine inspiration, trances, or simply medicine. If you saw angels floating above your bed after drinking a cup of mandrake wine, perhaps you had been blessed with a holy vision, or perhaps you had simply miscalculated the dosage and were about to collapse face first into the rushes on the floor. There was a blurred line between prayer and poison, between healing and hallucination, and people walked it daily. The plants were everywhere. The herbs grew wild. Monks cultivated them in neat little gardens inside their cloisters. Physicians wrote about them in thick herbals with elaborate drawings, and village healers handed them out like candy to desperate mothers trying to calm a screaming child. The supply was not limited. The question was always how much, how strong, and how dangerous. The variety of ways people consumed these substances would astonish us today. Some brewed roots into bitter teas that smelled like swamp water. Others crushed seeds into powders to be stirred into wine. There were ointments thick with animal fat that you rubbed onto the skin until visions of flight carried you through the rafters of your cottage. Sometimes the substance was consumed by accident, baked unknowingly into the daily bread, leading an entire village to dance until their feet bled and their bodies collapsed. Nature was both the dealer and the executioner, and she rarely provided dosage instructions. If a plant could ease pain, it could also kill you. If a mushroom made you laugh, it might also make you claw at your own skin in terror. The gamble was part of the experience. And yet, it wasn't just common folk experimenting in secret. Nobles, too, indulged. Imagine a lady at a feast, her silk dress heavy with embroidery, leaning close to another noblewoman and whispering that she has discovered a new beauty trick, a few drops of belladonna in the eyes to make the pupils wide, mysterious, alluring. The result? Blurry vision, sensitivity to light, and the possibility of meeting death disguised as cosmetics. But that didn't matter, because fashion has never been forgiving. Men, meanwhile, turned to strong wine, spiced with exotic herbs imported from the East, a luxury that came at a price, but promised both intoxication and a sense of power. The poor drank to survive, the rich drank to feel extraordinary. The reasons varied, but the pursuit of altered states united them. Religion, of course, cast its long shadow over the entire practice. The church was suspicious of anything that shifted perception. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. A monk who burned too much incense and swayed in ecstasy might be revered as holy, while a peasant woman who brewed henbane tea for her labor pains might be accused of witchcraft. The intent mattered. Seeing God in a haze of frankincense was acceptable. Seeing demons after smearing ointment on your chest was punishable by death. The very same symptoms could mark you as a saint or a sinner, depending entirely on who witnessed them and how much authority they carried. Medieval life was never fair, and intoxication was no exception. What fascinates us now is how deeply entwined these substances were with daily life. They weren't exotic, they weren't rare, they were woven into medicine, into ritual, into simple survival. Poppy extracts eased pain in surgeries before anesthetics were even imagined. Strong ale was drunk daily by children and adults alike because the water itself could kill you. Villagers accidentally poisoned themselves with ergot on rye bread so often that entire outbreaks of madness were recorded in chronicles. And somewhere, in a small mountain village, a beekeeper collected honey made from toxic flowers that could bring either prophetic dreams or convulsions. This wasn't a fringe culture, it was the culture. The strange highs of the Middle Ages were everywhere, hiding in gardens, kitchens, and even in church. So as you settle deeper into your blanket tonight, let your mind drift into that otherworldly fog of medieval intoxication. Imagine standing in a candlelit hut, the air thick with smoke from burning herbs, a healer chanting words you don't understand as she smears ointment across your skin. Imagine swallowing a cup of dark wine laced with something you can't quite name, and feeling your body go heavy while visions bloom behind your eyes. Imagine the terror of hearing that the bread you ate was cursed, and suddenly your limbs burn as though possessed. For them, this was not abstract history. This was daily life, equal parts medicine and madness. And maybe, just maybe, if you let yourself drift with them, you'll understand why a medieval peasant stared at a mushroom, smiled faintly, and decided the risk was worth it. Because in a world full of plagues, wars, and endless toil, sometimes all you wanted was to forget it all for just one night, to leave the mud and misery behind, and fly, even if only in your own mind. In the medieval world, plants were not gentle companions in the garden. They were tricksters, liars, and sometimes executioners in disguise. Imagine walking through a patch of scrubby land outside your village, barefoot because shoes were a luxury, and spotting a strange flower with pale petals nodding in the breeze. It looked innocent enough, yet your grandmother had warned you that this was henbane, a plant so unpredictable that it could either soothe your aching tooth or make you dance through the fields shrieking at shadows only you could see. For every safe herb like mint or chamomile, there were plants that whispered promises of visions and relief, while sharpening their claws just beneath the surface. Take henbane, for instance, one of the Middle Ages' most notorious plant companions. Its Latin name, Hyoscyamus niger, sounds dignified, almost respectable, but in practice, It was the herbal equivalent of rolling dice with the devil. In small doses, carefully measured, and prepared by someone who actually knew what they were doing, it could calm pain, ease insomnia, or dull the terrors of childbirth. A few crushed seeds in wine might help a nobleman drift into a heavy sleep before surgery, sparing him the full horror of a saw biting into bone. But misjudge the amount by even a pinch, and henbane became a chaos festival in your skull, mouth dry as sand, pupils dilated until you looked possessed, limbs twitching like a puppet in a storm, and visions so strong you might believe the family goat had begun reciting psalms. Medieval texts are full of warnings about henbane, but they are written in the cautious, almost reverent tone one reserves for unstable royalty. You did not disrespect henbane. You treated it with awe, as though it were both cure and curse bound into a single stalk. And then there was Mandrake, perhaps the most famous liar in the medieval apothecary. To modern eyes, it's just a root with a vaguely humanoid shape. But to the medieval imagination, it was a living being, a creature trapped in the earth, and when you pulled it from the soil, it screamed. Not a metaphorical scream, not a poetic cry, but a literal shriek, so powerful it was said to kill any man who heard it. Picture that, a farmer kneeling in the dirt, sweating, muttering prayers, tying the root to a dog's tail, then retreating a safe distance while urging the poor animal forward. The belief was that the dog would die in your place, sacrificed to the mandrake's terrible cry. And yet, despite the horror stories, people still wanted it. They risked death for the mandrake because it promised visions, prophetic dreams, and a sleep so deep it was almost like stepping into the afterlife. Physicians valued it as an anesthetic. Witches valued it as a tool of transformation. Lovers wore tiny dried mandrake figures in pouches, convinced they could attract fertility or ward off curses. It was dangerous, yes, but in a world where most remedies involved bloodletting with a rusty knife, mandrake seemed almost magical, a root that might turn misery into ecstasy if you survived the harvest. Then, lurking in the hedgerows, there was belladonna, the plant that tried to seduce and kill at the same time. The name means beautiful lady, and indeed, women dripped drops of its juice into their eyes to dilate their pupils, believing wide, dark eyes made them more alluring. Imagine leaning across a banquet table by candlelight, your vision swimming, your gaze unfocused, yet your admirers whispering how mysterious and enchanting you looked. But the cost of beauty was steep: blurred vision, blindness, and sometimes death. Beyond cosmetics, belladonna was mixed into potions, tinctures, and ointments that sent people into trances or convinced them they were flying through the night sky. Its alkaloids, atropine and scopolamine, twisted the nervous system until the world shimmered at the edges, until saints and demons appeared at the foot of your bed, whispering secrets you were never meant to hear. Some medieval midwives used belladonna carefully to ease pain in childbirth, while others were accused of witchcraft for even growing it in their gardens. It was a plant of contradictions, as likely to be found in a physician's satchel as in a trial transcript for sorcery. What made these plants so terrifying and so desirable was that they blurred the line between medicine and magic. A pinch of henbane could be healing, a handful could be madness. A sip of mandrake wine might bring sleep, a cup might bring death, and belladonna, depending on the intent of the user, could either be a cosmetic, a cure, or a curse. The dosage was everything, and dosage in the Middle Ages was a slippery business. There were no scales, no standardized measurements. Instructions in herbals read like riddles. Take as much as the weight of 3 beans, or boil until the vapor smells sweet. Imagine trusting your life to that kind of recipe. A distracted apothecary, a lazy monk, or a healer in a rush could turn a simple sedative into a lethal nightmare. And yet, people lined up for these remedies because the alternative was untreated pain, sleepless nights, or the grinding misery of existence. And this was not just the world of peasants in mud huts. In the grand halls of monasteries, monks carefully copied recipes into illuminated manuscripts, drawing elegant little sketches of mandrake roots shaped like tiny men dangling from the page. They wrote notes about boiling times, safe mixtures, and warnings written in the margins with quiet alarm. These herbals were treasured, passed from healer to healer, each recipe both a map to relief and a potential death sentence. Even kings and nobles consulted them, because in an age before modern science, the wisdom of plants was the only science they had. But alongside the careful practitioners were the reckless, the wandering herbalists who traveled from village to village, carried pouches stuffed with dried roots and mysterious powders. They promised cures for toothache, for melancholy, for sleeplessness, for heartbreak. And sometimes, yes, they delivered relief, but just as often, they delivered visions, delirium, and the slow dawning horror that the potion you just swallowed was not medicine, but a key to another, darker place. Stories circulated of peasants who drank henbane tea and then swore they had spent the night at a feast in hell. Others chewed mandrake and woke convinced they had been reborn as animals. These were not just stories, they were warnings, passed from mouth to mouth like folk tales, each one ending with the same moral. Nature does not forgive carelessness. And yet, there was fascination too. People loved the danger. They loved the stories of roots that screamed and flowers that whispered. They loved the idea that a plant might bridge the gap between the human world and the divine. In a life hemmed in by fields, taxes, and sermons, these substances offered glimpses of something beyond, something strange, terrifying, and intoxicating. The plants were never just plants. They were gates, and those who dared to step through often found themselves in landscapes they could not have imagined. So, in the flickering glow of a medieval cottage, with shadows dancing against the walls and the smell of herbs thick in the air, you might sip from a wooden cup and feel the world begin to tilt. The fire crackles, the wind moans outside, and then suddenly the room stretches, the shadows lengthen, and you are no longer sitting among family, but floating among phantoms. A root has lied to you, a flower has whispered its trick, and for the rest of the night, your soul wanders far from your body. And when dawn comes, if you wake at all, you might laugh it off, or weep, or never speak of it again, because in the Middle Ages, herbs that screamed and roots that lied were always waiting in the soil, ready to play their games with anyone bold or desperate enough to listen. The broomstick is such a cliché of witchcraft today that it almost feels cartoonish. Pointy hat, black cat, crooked nose, and of course soaring through the night sky, straddling a household cleaning tool. It's a Halloween prop, a child's drawing, a symbol of make-believe. But in the Middle Ages, the broomstick was no joke, no decoration. It was whispered about with fear, recorded with scandal, and tangled up with substances that could twist reality until a woman truly believed she had left her body behind and was flying through the dark above her village. The truth behind the flying witch was not some secret levitation spell, but a paste thick, pungent, and smeared on bare skin, a concoction known as the witch's ointment, or more delicately, the flying ointment. Imagine the scene, a dim cottage lit only by the red glow of embers, the air heavy with the smell of herbs slowly charring over a fire. A woman crouches at a rough-hewn table, grinding roots into powder, her hands stained green, her mortar sticky with resin. Into the mixture she stirs melted animal fat, thick and greasy, the base that will carry the poisons into the skin. Then she adds the dangerous plants, the ones every herbalist whispers about, but only the daring or the damned actually use. Henbane, mandrake, belladonna, sometimes hemlock or datura for extra force. Each ingredient is a story on its own, a lyre in plant form, but combined they become a chorus of hallucinations, a doorway into another world. The result is a paste that clings to the body, invisible once absorbed, but devastatingly effective at twisting the senses. The ointment could not be eaten. Taken by mouth, it was poison, plain and simple. Belladonna swallowed in large enough amounts would stop the heart. Mandrake would choke the lungs. Henbane would send convulsions racking through the body. But through the skin, through those thin, sensitive membranes of the human body, the alkaloids seeped in slowly, powerfully, and devastatingly. A dab on the wrists, a smear on the chest, a thick layer rubbed on the thighs, and within minutes, the world shifted. The user might feel weightless, might feel their body stretching beyond the cottage walls, might believe with absolute certainty that they were lifting off the ground. When inquisitors later interrogated supposed witches, they described journeys through the sky, feasts with the devil, gatherings in remote forests where spirits cavorted under the moon. To the modern eye, it sounds like fantasy, but to the user under the influence of the ointment, it was real, undeniable, as vivid as waking life. The broomstick, then, was not just a tool for cleaning floors, it was a delivery system. Wooden handles, smooth and polished, were perfect for smearing with ointment and pressing against the body in places where absorption was fastest. The details are rarely spelled out in polite medieval texts, but inquisitors, eager to prove their suspicions, wrote them down with relish. To ride a broomstick was not simply to mount a household tool. It was to apply the ointment directly where it would work most effectively, to let the poison enter the bloodstream through the body's most delicate gateways. The flight that followed was not physical, but it did not matter. The visions were overwhelming, immersive, and utterly convincing. In these altered states, a peasant woman might feel herself soar over the field she normally trudged through barefoot. She might look down and see her village shrinking below her, the roofs of cottages like tiny toys, the people oblivious to her passing above. She might believe she was carried to a mountaintop feast, where devils and spirits awaited, offering her strange foods, grotesque delights, promises of knowledge and power. She might dance in firelight, speak with animals, even transform into a beast herself, her body rippling with fur and wings. When she woke, exhausted, sprawled on the cold floorboards of her hut, the memories would cling like smoke, real, terrifying, intoxicating. Not everyone who encountered these ointments was accused of witchcraft. In fact, many of the recipes came from the same herbals studied by monks and physicians. The ingredients were not secret. They were listed in medical texts as pain relievers, sleep aids, and anesthetics. A small dose of belladonna might be used to numb pain during surgery. A touch of henbane could calm a restless mind. But combined, deliberately intensified, and smeared across the skin in a ritualistic context, they transformed into something dangerous. And because the church could not accept that visions might come from plants rather than saints, anyone who confessed to flying on a broomstick became proof of consorting with demons. Of course, inquisitors had their own agenda. A woman found delirious, muttering about strange visions, might have simply been poisoned by an ointment she barely understood, but to a suspicious priest, her story became evidence of a witch's Sabbath, of diabolical orgies in the night. Torture encouraged confessions, and soon there was a consistent pattern. The ointment, the broomstick, the flight, the feast, the reality. a hallucinatory trip induced by toxic plants, was buried under layers of fear and accusation. The myth of the flying witch took root, and it has never really left. And yet, beneath the fear, there was also fascination. The idea of flying, of escaping the confines of the mud and misery of daily life, was irresistible. Even today, who has not wished to lift off, to drift above their troubles, to leave the body behind and float free? The ointment promised exactly that. A liberation so powerful, it felt like magic. For the women and men who experimented with it, the consequences might be dire: madness, illness, even death. But for a few hours, they were no longer bound to the ground. They were free. Imagine lying in your narrow straw bed, your skin tingling, your mind unmoored. The cottage fades, the roof melts away, the stars wheel overhead, impossibly close, their light sharp and cold. You feel the rush of wind against your face, though you are motionless. Below, the village sleeps, unaware. You are soaring, not in flesh, but in spirit, and every sound, every sight is sharper, stranger. Voices call in languages you do not know. Beasts grin with human teeth. Fire dances without heat. This is the gift and curse of the ointment. It does not merely show you the world differently, it pulls you into another world altogether. And when morning comes, the body aches, the skin feels raw, the mind foggy, the stomach churns. Some wake with nothing more than a headache. Others never wake at all, their families left to wonder what demons snatched them in the night. And yet, even knowing the risks, people sought it out again and again, because the promise of flight, of visions, of power, was worth the danger. The ointment was not just a drug. It was a temptation, a key, a whispered promise that there was more to reality than mud, sweat, and prayer. This is the world behind the broomstick. Not a cartoon, not a fairy tale, but a paste made of roots and poisons, smeared on skin, turning sleep into flight and women into witches in the eyes of their neighbors. And in the glow of a medieval hearth, as shadows flicker and the ointment soaks deeper into the flesh, one can almost hear the rush of wings, the laughter of unseen figures, and the thrum of a night sky filled with bodies rising from their beds, riding their broomsticks into the dark, not because they were servants of Satan, but because the plants had lied to them, beautifully, convincingly, until they believed it. If you picture a medieval monastery, you might imagine solemnity, stone cloisters, flickering candles, robed men chanting in unison, while the scent of incense curls heavenward. Holy, disciplined, restrained. And yet beneath that image lurked a very different reality. Monks were not just custodians of prayer. They were also brewers, gardeners, experimenters, and occasionally accidental psychonauts. Their world was saturated not only with chants and scripture, but with smoke, wine, ale, and an endless supply of substances that made the divine feel much closer than perhaps it should have. Step first into the chapel, dim and crowded with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. The air is heavy with frankincense and myrrh, resinous substances burned in great swinging censers until clouds hang thick as fog. The priests insisted this was not for intoxication, but purification, to banish demons, to cleanse the spirit, to honor God, and yet the effect was undeniable. Modern science tells us that frankincense contains compounds that soothe the nervous system, easing anxiety, blurring perception, creating a calm that borders on trance. In a poorly ventilated medieval church, with smoke pooling in corners and filling lungs, it was not divine inspiration alone that left worshippers swaying with half-lidded eyes. It was chemistry, turning the prayers into something half real, half dream. Imagine a young novice fasting for days, dehydrated, exhausted, standing barefoot on cold stone through endless hours of chanting while incense smoke coils around him. His stomach growls, his head spins, his knees tremble, and suddenly he sees light where there is none, hears voices in the ringing silence. To him, these are visions of saints, of angels, proof of holiness. To us, it looks suspiciously like oxygen deprivation and mild intoxication. But in the Middle Ages, who cared for such distinctions? A vision was a vision, and if God chose to speak through smoke, so be it. And when the monks were not breathing in the divine fog, they were brewing. Brewing was their pride, their science, their craft. Water was unsafe, crawling with disease, so beer became daily hydration. Even children drank small beer, low in alcohol, but safer than any stream. But in the monasteries, the brewing was elevated. Recipes perfected over centuries produced ales rich and strong, sometimes flavored with herbs, rosemary, sage, yarrow, each adding not only taste but a kick that bent the mind. Before hops became standard, medieval beer was often spiked with a mixture called greit, a blend of psychoactive plants that gave drinkers not just a buzz, but a full-body rush. Henbane, heather, bog myrtle, all could be included. A pint of greit beer might make a monk feel not merely tipsy, but blessed, drifting toward ecstasy under the vaulted ceiling of the refectory. And the wine, oh, the wine, sacred, symbolic, and consumed daily at Mass. But Mass was not once a year, it was every day, and monks, with their duty to celebrate the Eucharist, were permitted to drink regularly in the name of devotion. A goblet here, a chalice there, and soon the line between sacrament and celebration blurred. The vineyards of monastic orders flourished, producing gallons upon gallons of wine that soaked through the Middle Ages like blood through linen. And when plain wine grew boring, spices were added: cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, herbs imported at great cost from the East. These spiced wines were intoxicating not only in alcohol content, but in the warmth that spread through the body, the tingling on the tongue, the sense that one was transported beyond the cold, damp walls of the monastery into a glowing, fragrant dream. Picture the scene at a winter feast. Monks sit shoulder to shoulder at long wooden tables, their tonsured heads bent not only in prayer, but in laughter, their cheeks flushed red from cups refilled too often. A jug of strong ale is passed, a loaf of bread broken, the smoky air carrying not only chants but bursts of song. They sing not psalms now, but ribald verses, the kind that scandalized bishops but made the long nights bearable. And in their cups they felt close to God, or at least closer than they did sober. Perhaps holiness was easier to find at the bottom of a tankard than on a freezing midnight vigil. This was the paradox of monastic life. Strict rules against excess paired with a culture that embraced fermentation, smoke, and occasional overindulgence. The same monk who wrote a sermon against drunkenness might later be found face down in the refectory, snoring gently while his brothers stepped around him. Chroniclers grumbled about it, bishops complained, but nothing stopped the flow of drink, because in truth, beer and wine were lifelines. They preserved health, carried calories, and dulled the edges of an existence devoted to obedience and silence. And then, of course, there were the mystics, men and women who pushed their bodies and minds to extremes. They fasted until they saw visions, inhaled smoke until their heads spun, drank concoctions of herbs that would terrify a modern pharmacist. Some swore they levitated during prayer, rising inches off the ground, carried upward by divine light. Skeptics might suggest fumes and malnutrition did the heavy lifting, but to the mystics, The experience was pure revelation. Saints wrote of ecstatic unions with God, encounters that left them trembling and weeping. Their words were copied into manuscripts, treasured as evidence of holiness. No one dared suggest they were simply high on incense and adrenaline. Outside the cloisters, ordinary folk mirrored these practices in their own way. Taverns served as the secular counterpart to monasteries, filled not with chants but with shouts, laughter, and the clatter of mugs. Alehouses were the therapy offices of the medieval world, where peasants drowned sorrows, celebrated births, plotted rebellions, and occasionally collapsed into ditches. But in the monasteries, the drinking was cloaked in respectability. Beer brewed by monks was not just tolerated, but celebrated, even seen as holy work. Brewing was charity, providing safe drink for the community. Brewing was art, raising funds for the abbey. Brewing was devotion, because after all, didn't God want his servants to be healthy enough to keep praying? The irony is sharp. While inquisitors condemned peasants for their suspicious potions and ointments, monks quietly brewed psychoactive beers and inhaled incense clouds thick enough to choke an ox. One woman's vision from a belladonna salve was heresy, while a monk's vision during Vespers was saintly. But in both cases, the brain was swimming in altered chemistry, and the boundaries between heaven and earth were smudged into something dreamlike. So picture it again, a chapel at midnight, the air so dense with incense that it feels like breathing honey, a choir of monks chanting until the sound itself becomes a physical weight pressing on your skull. You kneel, your stomach empty from fasting, your head light, your eyes closing, the candles blur, the stone floor tilts, and suddenly you are not kneeling anymore. You are rising, your body weightless, your heart surging with joy and terror. You think you see wings unfolding above the altar, a figure made of light bending down to whisper. Is it God, an angel, or just the frankincense doing its work? You will never know. All you know is that you were touched by something beyond, and when dawn comes, you stumble back to your cell, convinced you have brushed against the divine. This was the gift of drunken monks and holy smoke, to transform cold stone into shimmering vision, to turn the daily grind of prayer into something ecstatic, to remind even the most disciplined servant of God that sometimes the quickest path to heaven was through a haze of ale and a cloud of resin. Whether it was holiness or intoxication mattered little, because in the Middle Ages, the line between them was as thin as the smoke drifting toward the rafters, vanishing into the dark. While Europe was fumbling with roots that screamed and ointments that burned the skin raw, further east, a very different relationship with intoxication was blossoming. In the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age, from Cairo to Baghdad, from Damascus to Isfahan, scholars, poets, mystics, and wanderers were exploring altered states with something far more refined, hashish, a substance born from the resin of the cannabis plant, pressed and prepared into small blocks or crumbles, mixed with honey or spices, consumed not with fear of demons, but with a surprising degree of openness. In the East, intoxication was not just the reckless gamble of peasants desperate to numb pain. It was a cultural conversation tied to mysticism, poetry, philosophy, and faith. Picture a bustling marketplace in 11th century Cairo, the air heavy with the scent of spices, roasted lamb, and the sweet smoke of incense curling from braziers. Amid stalls of silks and ceramics, a vendor offers small cakes made with hashish, sticky with honey, perfumed with cloves and cardamom. A traveler buys one, tucks it into his robe, and later that night, in a candlelit room above a caravanserai, he eats it slowly. Soon his limbs soften, his thoughts expand, and his eyes grow wide with the sense that he is no longer alone in the room. To him, it is not intoxication, but communion, a dissolving of the self, a step closer to God. Hashish carried a reputation of paradox. For Sufi mystics, the wandering seekers of divine union, it was a tool, a way to break down the walls of ego and open the soul to the infinite. They described the sensation in verses that still shimmer with longing. One poet writes of dissolving like sugar in milk, disappearing into the sweetness of divine presence. Another compares the high to the wind carrying him beyond himself, stripping him of worldly burdens until only the eternal remains. In their hands, hashish was not a distraction, but a doorway, a way to climb out of the ordinary and glimpse the face of the divine. But not everyone agreed. Many Islamic rulers and scholars frowned upon its use, fearing it encouraged laziness, irreverence, or excessive laughter in places where solemnity was expected. Edicts were issued, bans proclaimed. Hashish was outlawed again and again, declared immoral, disruptive, dangerous, and yet, like every prohibition in history, the bans did little. Hashish flowed through cities and villages, shared in gardens, consumed in secret, celebrated in verse, cursed in sermons. The more it was banned, the more it became entwined with rebellion, with youth, with the stubborn refusal of the human spirit to let go of joy. One of the strangest legends that attached itself to hashish was the story of the Hashashin, the assassins. In the mountains of Persia, a secretive sect led by Hassani Saba supposedly trained killers by intoxicating them with hashish, showing them visions of paradise and convincing them that obedience would return them to those gardens forever. Whether the tale is truth or slander, it wrapped hashish in mystery, linking it forever with shadows, knives, and whispered conspiracies. European crusaders brought the story back west, where the word assassin was born, stained with both fear and fascination. The truth was likely far more complicated, but in the medieval imagination, hashish became not just a drug, but a weapon of loyalty, devotion, and death. Yet, outside the conspiracies and bans, hashish was remarkably ordinary. In Damascus, artisans ate it after long days of labor to ease their aches. In Cairo, scholars wrote of its effects with clinical detail, noting how it sharpened thought in some, dulled it in others. In Baghdad, gatherings of poets and musicians were fueled not only by wine, despite prohibitions, but also by hashish, its effects weaving into the rhythm of lute and verse. Compared to Europe's stumbling experiments with belladonna and henbane, this was sophistication, cultivation, a culture that treated intoxication not as an accident, but as an art. Imagine a Sufi lodge on the edge of the desert, its walls glowing red with the last light of sunset. Inside, men sit cross-legged on woven mats, their heads bowed, their breath slow. One of them passes around a small bowl of hashish mixed with honey. They eat in silence, then begin to chant, voices low at first, then rising, weaving together in a hypnotic rhythm. The floor trembles under the weight of their footsteps as they whirl in circles, their robes flaring, their eyes closed. To an outsider, it looks like madness. To them, it is annihilation, the self melting away, only God remaining. And when they collapse at last, sweat-soaked, gasping, they speak of visions of endless gardens, rivers of light, the beloved waiting in every corner of the universe. This was not the frantic, fearful intoxication of a peasant who had eaten moldy bread and found demons in the rafters. This was deliberate, structured, even sacred. Hashish was woven into the fabric of mysticism, not as a trick, but as a tool. And yet, like all tools, it was double-edged, too much, and the mystic was not enlightened. but lost, stumbling, incoherent, mocked by neighbors. Too often, and the seeker became dependent, unable to pray without the resin's whisper. The balance was delicate, and many slipped. That, perhaps, was why rulers feared it so, not only for the laughter it provoked, but for the way it eroded boundaries between the holy and the profane. Meanwhile, Europe looked on with suspicion, baffled by tales of resin cakes and ecstatic dances. When crusaders returned, they brought stories of strange Eastern substances that made men fearless, loyal, and dangerous. They did not understand the nuance, the poetry, the mysticism. They saw only enemies drugged into obedience, shadows with knives. And so, while in Cairo a Sufi might dissolve into the presence of God with a mouthful of hashish, in Paris a priest warned his congregation that the East was steeped in devil's grass. But the reality was far richer. Hashish was laughter in the market, solace for the weary, inspiration for poets, a tool for mystics, and a thorn in the side of rulers. It was celebrated, condemned, outlawed, embraced, and above all, lived with. And in the candlelight of medieval nights, as smoke drifted upward from censers in churches and from braziers in Sufi lodges, both East and West were, in their own ways, reaching for the same thing, a softening of the world, a glimpse of something beyond the grind of existence, a taste of the divine, however they named it. Bread, the staff of life, the humble loaf that sat on every medieval table, brown, dense, chewy, sometimes stale, sometimes fresh, but always present. It was more than food, it was survival itself. A family without bread was a family staring into famine, and yet in the damp fields of northern Europe, in the chill of long winters and wet springs, bread sometimes turned traitor. Grain carried secrets, and one of the darkest was a parasite, ergot, a black, crusty fungus that clung to rye like a curse. To the untrained eye, it looked only slightly odd, a shriveled kernel among the golden grains. To those who ate it, it was disaster, hallucinogen, torture, and sometimes death. This was not deliberate intoxication. This was accidental madness, baked into the daily bread. Imagine a small village in the Rhineland after weeks of rain. Rye fields glisten dark, stalks heavy, ears speckled with blackened growths. The harvest is meager, but hunger presses harder than caution. Families gather the grain, grind it, bake it. Soon the smell of fresh loaves fills the air, and children tear into them eagerly. But as the days pass, something strange stirs in the village. People begin to twitch, their fingers clawing at invisible shapes. Some laugh uncontrollably, others shriek, legs cramp, arms spasm, jaws lock tight. One woman swears flames crawl beneath her skin. Another insists her hands have turned to snakes. A man collapses in the square, his body jerking violently, while onlookers whisper of demons. This was ergotism, also known by grim nicknames, St. Anthony's fire, or the burning sickness. There were two forms, both equally cruel. Convulsive ergotism came with seizures, spasms, hallucinations, delirium. Victims writhed on the ground, laughing, sobbing, speaking nonsense, seeing visions of saints and monsters alike. It looked like possession, and in an age where demons were as real as livestock, that was the obvious explanation. Then there was gangrenous ergotism, far worse in its silence. The fungus constricted blood vessels, starving limbs of circulation, fingers blackened, toes shriveled, legs rotted, until they simply fell away. The pain was indescribable, the smell unbearable, the fear absolute. In both forms, it was a living nightmare, inflicted not by sorcery, but by breakfast. The scale was shocking. Entire communities could be stricken, waves of seizures and visions sweeping through villages. Chroniclers described groups of people dancing uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. The infamous dancing plagues of medieval Europe may have been fueled not by madness or hysteria alone, but by ergot-contaminated bread, driving people into convulsions they could not control. Imagine a town square filled with dozens of bodies moving frantically, some collapsing, others carried away foaming at the mouth, the church bells tolling as priests tried to exorcise demons, while bakers quietly wondered if maybe the rye had gone bad. And yet, in the cruelty of ergot lay strange gifts. The hallucinations were vivid, immersive, terrifying. Victims reported visions of angels, of devils, of voices whispering in their ears. A peasant could fall asleep in his hovel and wake believing he had spent the night in heaven or hell. Was it divine judgment or poisoned grain? To the medieval mind, the line was thin, and most believed the first explanation. God was punishing them. Demons were tempting them. Saints were appearing. The bread became a stage on which the unseen world played its drama, and no one doubted the reality of what they saw. Hospitals sprang up to care for victims, many run by the Order of St. Anthony, whose monks tended the afflicted with diets of wheat bread rather than rye. Remarkably, this simple substitution often cured the illness. Patients entered screaming, convulsing, clawing at their flesh, and weeks later, many walked out calmer, healed, their visions faded. The Antonine monks became famous, their black robes marked with a blue cross, their pig farms supplying meat, their hospitals offering refuge. Pilgrims flocked to shrines of St. Anthony, praying for relief from the burning sickness. And slowly, without anyone realizing it, the cure was discovered. Eat wheat, not rye. But for peasants who had no wheat fields, the cure was unreachable. Rye was what they had, and rye was what betrayed them. The terror of ergot spread into culture, folklore, even witch trials. Some historians believe the paranoia in Salem centuries later was fueled by ergot-contaminated bread, with young girls convulsing, hallucinating, and accusing neighbors of witchcraft. Whether true or not, the theory captures the same eerie truth that the fungus could warp perception so completely that entire communities turned against themselves. In the medieval world, where devils lurked in every shadow, ergot was a perfect accomplice. But ergot was not only tragedy. In tiny, accidental ways, it was also history's earliest psychedelic. Villagers who survived spoke of visions, of colors brighter than the sun, of hearing voices that told secrets, of feeling their bodies float beyond the earth. They were not seeking these states, but they found them, baked into their bread, and in a strange twist of fate, centuries later, scientists would isolate from ergot the compound lysergic acid, the foundation of LSD. The medieval peasants writhing in fields and dancing in squares were, without knowing it, pioneers of altered consciousness, unwilling participants in the first great psychedelic experiment of Europe. So imagine again a small cottage, a loaf of rye bread, cooling on the hearth. A mother slices it, serves it to her children. They eat hungrily, smiling. But within days, the smiles twist into grimaces, their limbs jerk in spasms, their words turn to babble. Neighbors whisper, priests shout about demons. The family prays, helpless. And outside, in the fields, the rye sways gently in the wind, each stalk carrying the blackened kernels that will seed the next round of visions, suffering, and flames. The fungus in your daily bread was not a choice, not an indulgence, not a ritual. It was fate, indifferent and cruel. And for medieval Europe, It was proof that even the most ordinary, humble food could turn traitor, carrying you from the safety of your cottage into a nightmare of fire, visions, and madness. Honey in the Middle Ages was a luxury. Golden, sticky, sweet beyond anything most peasants ever tasted. It was treasured for medicine, for feasts, for brewing into mead that warmed the belly on cold nights. Bees were holy workers, their hives tended with reverence, their wax shaped into candles that lit the altars of Christendom. But in certain corners of the medieval world, honey carried a secret sting. It wasn't just sweet, it was dangerous. In the steep mountain valleys of Anatolia, where bees feasted on rhododendron flowers blooming pink against dark cliffs, honey turned strange. Locals called it delibal, mad honey, and it lived up to its name. Imagine a soldier trudging through a mountain pass, weary, starving, and spotting jars of honey left temptingly by the roadside, golden treasure glistening in clay pots, a gift from the gods perhaps, or the generosity of villagers. The soldiers scoop it greedily, smearing it on bread, licking it from their fingers. At first, warmth fills the body, a buzzing spreads through the veins, pleasant, almost dreamlike. Then the world tilts, limbs grow heavy, vision blurs, the stomach heaves. Some laugh uncontrollably, others fall writhing, clutching their guts, gasping for breath. Within hours, the camp is chaos, warriors moaning in the dirt, too weak to lift their swords. The enemy, watching from the trees, moves in to slaughter them with ease. Mad honey had won the battle before the blades were drawn. The effect came from granotoxins, compounds in rhododendron nectar that slipped unnoticed into the honey. In small doses, they brought dizziness, warmth, perhaps even visions. In larger doses, they slowed the heart, dropped blood pressure, and dragged the victim into convulsions, sweats, delirium. To a medieval villager who had grown up among the mountains, this was no surprise. They knew to treat mad honey with respect, a spoonful at most, a medicine for pain or an elixir for vision, but to outsiders, it was a trap disguised as sweetness. This was not a medieval discovery. Ancient writers had warned of it centuries earlier. Xenophon, the student of Socrates, described his Greek soldiers stumbling into convulsions after feasting on honeycombs in the Black Sea region. The Romans wrote of poisoned troops, their mighty legions undone, not by swords but by bees. But the tales did not end with antiquity. Through the Middle Ages, stories lingered of honey that maddened men, honey that toppled armies, honey that whispered secrets into the brain. Yet, for locals, it was not always poison. It was also medicine, ritual, a door to other states. A peasant woman might stir a spoonful into hot wine for her husband's aching joints. A shepherd might eat a small lump before sleep, hoping for prophetic dreams. A healer might mix it into a tonic for fever or melancholy, believing the visions it inspired were messages from saints or ancestors. The same substance that crippled soldiers could soothe a household, depending only on dose and intent. That was the eternal riddle of medieval intoxicants. The line between cure and curse was always thinner than a strand of silk. But of course, honey was also trade. In ceramic jars sealed with wax, mad honey traveled along mountain paths into markets, its reputation both feared and desired. Buyers sought it for potency, for the thrill of danger, for the possibility of visions. A jar might be passed as a gift between nobles, whispered about as a rare delicacy, consumed in small, careful amounts at feasts where courtiers giggled nervously and waited to see who would collapse first. The mystery only added to its allure. Picture the scene in a smoky tavern on the Black Sea coast. A merchant sets down a jar of honey, thick and red, richer than the pale stuff most peasants knew. The innkeeper dips a spoon, tastes it, his eyes widening as warmth rushes through him. He licks his lips, hands trembling slightly. The night grows louder, laughter sharper, songs slurred into strange rhythms. Some patrons sway in their seats, others collapse to the floor, their faces pale but grinning, as though they have seen something the sober cannot. Was it poison? A miracle? In the medieval mind, the two were not so far apart. What made mad honey unique among medieval intoxicants was its betrayal of trust. Honey was supposed to be pure, wholesome, safe. Bread might betray you with fungus, beer might cloud your judgment, herbs might lie, but honey was holy. It was medicine. It was sweetness. It was light. And yet here was honey that laughed at you, that beckoned you with gold, and then hurled you into dizziness and collapse. It was sweetness with teeth. The stories of mad honey often ended with humiliation. Soldiers felled without a fight, peasants curled on the floor, nobles drooling at banquets. And yet the tales were retold with fascination, because behind the humiliation was a glimpse of something strange. Visions, laughter, a step into another world. For some, that was worth the risk. For others, it was proof that even God's sweetest gift could carry a hidden curse. So imagine again a medieval traveler, weary, stumbling into a mountain village. A woman offers him bread, dipped in honey, smiling gently. He eats, grateful, the sweetness melting on his tongue. At first, relief floods him, warmth blooming through his body. Then the edges blur, the woman's face stretches, her smile twists, the room spins. He reaches out for balance, but the floor slides away beneath him. He collapses, gasping, eyes wide with visions only he can see. Around him, villagers watch with calm indifference. They've seen this before. It is only mad honey doing its work, teaching yet another outsider that sweetness is never without danger. In the end, mad honey was not just food, not just poison. It was a trickster, a golden lie in a jar, a reminder that even the gifts of bees could pull you out of yourself and into a night of visions. And in the Middle Ages, when every day was already balanced between misery and miracle, a spoonful of honey that could topple an army or carry you into dreams was simply another reminder that nature always kept the last laugh. Not every intoxicating journey of the Middle Ages began in a monastery or a noble's hall. Often it began in a smoky cottage at the edge of a village, where a woman with too many wrinkles and too many secrets kept jars, bundles, and bottles hidden in a wooden chest. She wasn't a doctor. Doctors spoke Latin, wore robes, and charged fees higher than most peasants could pay in a year. She was a healer, a wise woman, a cunning person. She learned her craft not from universities, but from mothers and grandmothers, from trial and error, from watching which herbs made sheep stagger and which soothed a child's fever. She was the one you turned to when the official world failed you, and her cabinet, whether a literal box or a mental library, was filled with substances that healed, numbed, or sent you spiraling into visions you might never forget. Picture the cottage. Smoke stains the rafters. Herbs hang in bunches from the ceiling, their dried leaves rattling when the wind sneaks through cracks in the walls. On the table lies a mortar and pestle, worn smooth from decades of grinding. Jars filled with roots, seeds, powders, and sticky resins are stacked precariously on shelves. Some smell sweet, others bitter, still others like rotting hay. Each has a story, each has a price, and each could shift reality in ways both wondrous and terrible. You arrive with your problem. Perhaps your child will not stop crying, or your husband's leg is infected, or you yourself are plagued by dreams so violent you cannot sleep. The healer listens, nods, and rummages through her secret cabinet. For a fever, she might bring out willow bark, bitter but soothing. For sleeplessness, poppy resin scraped and dried to be dissolved in wine. For melancholy, a tea of herbs that lifts the spirit, sometimes because it calms, sometimes because it simply confuses the brain into forgetting its grief. She knows exactly how much to give, and when she doesn't, she pretends she does. Confidence, after all, is half the cure. But not everything in her cabinet is so gentle. There are jars of henbane seeds, black and oily, used sparingly to dull pain, but capable of dragging a man into delirium. There are dried mandrake roots, twisted into little human shapes, carried as charms, or boiled into potions that knock the drinker into unconsciousness. There are leaves of belladonna, a plant as beautiful as it is deadly, used to dilate pupils or ease childbirth, but also to summon visions of winged beasts and devils. And there are stranger things still, dried toads ground into powder, ashes of animal bones, even bodily fluids carefully collected and stored, because the line between medicine and magic was always blurry. For the healer, these substances were tools, neither good nor evil. A teaspoon could heal, a handful could kill, and the choice of how to use them depended on the need, and sometimes on the payment. A desperate man who wanted relief from pain might get a salve that calmed him. A woman who wanted her rival gone might receive the same ingredients in different proportions. To outsiders, it looked like sorcery. To the healer, it was chemistry, learned through centuries of trial and error, whispered recipes, and the memory of which neighbor had survived and which had not. The church despised these women, at least officially. Priests thundered against witchcraft, accused healers of consorting with demons, condemned their ointments and potions as sinful. And yet, when the priest's own nephew fell ill, where did he send the boy? To the healer. Because prayer might save the soul, but it rarely cured an infected wound. And so, in every village, the healer endured, half feared, half beloved, always needed. And with the healing came the visions. A man given poppy wine might sink into dreams so vivid he swore he had left his body. A woman dosed with henbane tea might see angels or demons, their forms shimmering in the firelight. A child brushed with ointment might laugh and babble at shadows that seemed suddenly alive. Sometimes these experiences were welcomed, seen as holy, miraculous. Other times they terrified families who whispered of possession, witchcraft, curses. The healer never admitted doubt. She simply smiled, nodded, and insisted the remedy had done its work. If the visions frightened you, that was between you and God. Imagine sitting by the fire in that cottage, cup in hand, the bitter liquid sliding down your throat. At first, nothing. Then a warmth, a tingling, a sense that the room is expanding. Shadows dance longer, voices sound closer, the fire hisses as though whispering your name. You grip the chair, but your body feels far away. The healer watches calmly, nodding, as if this is ordinary, and to her it is. She has seen this 100 times. You are just one more traveler, passing through the door between the world of flesh and the world of visions. You might come back unchanged. You might come back shaken, or you might not come back at all. The healer's cabinet was more than storage. It was power. In a world where nobility wielded swords and priests wielded scripture, she wielded plants, powders, and secrets. Neighbors both respected and resented her. They whispered about her in the fields, accused her of witchcraft, but lined up at her door when their children were sick. Some kissed her hand, others spat at her shadow, but they all came because no one else had what she had, access to nature's most dangerous gifts. And in those jars and bundles lay the truth of medieval intoxication, not the refined edibles of the East, not the holy wines of monasteries, but the raw, earthy, unpredictable power of plants and resins drawn straight from the soil. The healer knew the doses, or at least pretended she did. She knew the prayers to chant, the gestures to make, the stories to tell that would calm the fearful, while the potion worked its way through their blood. She was both pharmacist and priestess, both doctor and witch, both savior and scapegoat. And every time someone left her cottage trembling from visions, or smiling with relief, or carried out by relatives when the remedy was too strong, her reputation grew. So picture it again, the wooden chest creaking open, the healer's hands moving confidently among jars and bundles, the smell of dried herbs and old smoke filling the air, a spoonful of powder stirred into wine, a paste smeared on the skin, a charm tied around the neck, the line between healing and hallucination vanishing like smoke in the rafters, and outside, the village whispers, uncertain whether to thank her or condemn her, whether she serves God or the devil. But inside her cottage, the healer knows only this: everything in the cabinet is both remedy and poison, miracle and curse. It is simply a matter of how much you take and how willing you are to believe the visions that follow.